I still remember the color of the sky that morning, an impossible shade of pale silver, the kind you only see when snow decides to keep its secrets. We were 4 that day, 2 tourists from Seattle, a photographer from Portland, and me, the one supposed to keep them safe. 12 years guiding in Olympic National Park had taught me what to expect from its moods. The soft warnings in the wind, the voices of branches creaking before a storm, the quick shadows of elk vanishing between the firs. Nothing in that forest had ever surprised me until that morning. The snow was fresh, maybe 30 centimeters deep, untouched except for our tracks. It made the forest look newborn, like it had just exhaled into existence. Around 9, we were climbing a narrow ridge near Sauta Creek when I saw the prints. At first, I thought they belonged to a snowshoer until I crouched and felt the size with my glove. 45 centimeters long, 18 wide, each toe pressed clean into the crust. They ran in a straight line through the trees, not winding like a human stride, but arrow true, as if whoever or whatever had walked here didn't bother with obstacles. I tried to laugh, to call it strange and move on, but the words never left my mouth. Bears were hibernating. Moose didn't leave prints like these. The heel marks were deep but too shallow for the weight they implied. It was as if the ground had decided to hold something up that didn't belong to gravity. We followed, at about 400 meters in. A sound cracked the rhythm of our steps. 3 heavy knocks, echoing through the trees like someone beating a hollow drum. The forest stilled so suddenly it felt choreographed. Even the air seemed to forget how to move. Then, from the other side, a reply. 2 longer knocks. A conversation between invisible giants. The photographer Alan raised his camera. I watched his hands shake as he scanned the tree line. In the viewfinder, he caught movement. A dark column sliding behind a cedar trunk 80 meters ahead. He whispered that it was big, too big, but when I looked there was nothing. Only snow drifting from the branches as if the trees had exhaled. Then came the smell. I've spent enough winters tracking wildlife to recognize decay, musk, and fur, but this was something else, like wet wool mixed with metal, like a barn after rain, but sharper, heavier, wrong. It filled my lungs until I felt dizzy. That's when I told them quietly but clearly, we're going back to the trail. No running, no talking, don't look behind you. I didn't say that because I was afraid. I said it because I knew whatever was behind us could already hear our hearts. As we moved, the forest began to protest, branches snapping in rhythm, not randomly but almost keeping pace with us. It sounded like something matching our stride, breaking limbs not because they blocked the path but because it wanted us to know they were there. When we finally reached the main trail, the sound stopped. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it felt surgical, as if the forest had been cut open and emptied of life. I've guided hikers through blizzards, fog thick enough to erase your own hands, nights when owls screamed like people, but I'd never felt a silence that behaved like it was watching. We made it back to base before dusk. No one spoke. No jokes, no questions, just the hiss of the stove and the sound of melting snow dripping from our boots. It wasn't until the fire burned low that Alan asked the question hanging between all of us. What was that? I didn't answer. I told him I'd seen prints like those before, 4 times in 12 years. Once near Lake Crescent in 2011. Back then, I'd laughed it off as a prank by college kids. But those tracks had gone, straight through a wall of thorny brush no person could cross without shredding their clothes. The park administration hates stories like that. They call them distractions. Bad for tourism, bad for business. I learned early on to keep my mouth shut. But when I closed my eyes that night, I kept hearing the rhythm of those knocks. 3 short, 2 long. A code I couldn't decipher. Alan uploaded his photos weeks later. He showed me one before publishing it. You can barely see anything, just a gray blur between trees. But when you zoom in, the blur has a shape. Shoulders wider than a door frame. A head sunken low, arms that almost brush the ground. He said it could be light distortion. I wanted to believe that. For months afterward, I returned alone to that trail. I told myself it was for research, for closure. But deep down it was something darker, a compulsion, like needing to hear a word that was whispered but never finished. Each time the forest felt different. The animals stayed away. Jays that usually followed hikers for crumbs vanished. The wind didn't sound the same. It carried a low hum, almost electrical, just at the edge of hearing. I tried recording it once, but the microphone picked up nothing, just static, as if the forest erased its own evidence. In late March, I found the prints again, half melted but still clear enough to measure. They stopped abruptly near the edge of a frozen pond. No return trail, no sign of departure. Just vanished as though the creature had stepped into the reflection instead of across it. That night I dreamed I was back there standing by that pond. The ice was thin, pulsing under my boots. I could see my reflection, but it wasn't moving with me. It stood still, just breathing. I woke to the same smell from that day, the wet wool and metal hanging faintly in the air of my cabin. Sometimes I tell myself it's just memory that lingers. That smell doesn't travel across miles. That sound doesn't echo years later. But every winter when the snow thickens and the forest forgets its own voice, I hear those 3 knocks again, somewhere deep in the valley, answered by 2 longer ones. I've stopped guiding that route. I still hike, but never alone after sunset. And every time I pass a cedar split clean down the middle, no claw marks, no storm damage, just broken. I remember the sound of something walking parallel to me, unseen but not gone. Maybe it's still there, waiting for someone else to follow the prints. Someone curious enough to ignore that instinct that whispers, turn back. Maybe the forest keeps its promises better than we do. It was more than a year before I set foot in those woods again. I told myself I'd retired from guiding, that I was done with the whispers and half glimpses that followed me home. But the truth is I couldn't stay away. There's something about unanswered questions that eats at you, something primitive that won't let the mind rest. I kept thinking about those knocks, about the smell, about the prints that stopped at the frozen pond like the earth had swallowed them whole. By September of 2022, I was in Montana, visiting an old friend from my ranger days, Jim Carter, a hunter who had spent more time in the Bitterroot Mountains than most people spend in their own homes. I hadn't told him about what happened in Olympic. I didn't need to. The moment he saw my face that morning, he said quietly, "You've heard them too." That night we sat around his campfire, his friends busy setting up tents in the Lost Trail Valley. The air was sharp, clean, heavy with the scent of pine resin and wood smoke. The flames painted our faces in gold and red. He told me about the knocks, the bent trees, the silence that falls before they start. His words felt like déjà vu, as if the forest had been telling the same story through different mouths for generations. The next day we found them, trees twisted at impossible angles, young firs bent into arches 3 meters high, their fibers splintered but not broken. It would have taken machinery to do that. Jim said they'd appeared overnight, and I believed him. You can tell when something has lived with the land. And those trees looked wounded, not destroyed like something had tested its strength there. That evening, the mountains grew strangely quiet. Normally, the dusk here is a chorus of small lives, crickets, owls, the distant rumble of elk. But that night, the world seemed to withdraw its sound, like the volume had been turned down on creation itself. Around 11, the first knocks came. 3 short, a pause, then 2 long. The same rhythm from Washington. I remember sitting upright in my tent, my heartbeat syncing with the rhythm outside. Jim whispered my name, voice barely a breath. "They're talking again." From the opposite ridge came a reply. The second pattern was clearer, sharper, like the voice of something younger, angrier. The 2 sets of knocks began answering each other, 10 minutes apart, then 5, then 1. The pauses stretched and tightened, like a conversation losing patience. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe falling branches, maybe echo, maybe the mind recreating what it fears. But when the third voice joined in, coming from the east, all logic dissolved. 3 directions, 3 rhythms, like a triangle closing in. The ground under me began to tremble slightly, not like an earthquake, but like the heartbeat of something buried alive. Every vibration seemed to come from beneath the soil, subtle but intentional. Jim looked at me through the dim light of his flashlight, his eyes reflecting the same realization. Whatever it wasn't far. We stayed inside the tents until dawn. No one slept. Around 3 a.m., the knocking stopped. The silence after was almost painful. I could hear the fabric of the tent expand with each breath I took. At sunrise, we searched the area. The dew on the grass was untouched, except for a line of depressions in the soil, leading toward the tree line. Not footprints, just impressions, like something too heavy for its shape had passed through. At one of the trees, we found a branch stripped clean, as if peeled by human hands, the bark still wet from the force. And there, hanging in the lower branches, were strands of hair, long, coarse, dark brown. I touched one. It was thick, heavier than horsehair, rough enough to scrape the skin. When I lifted it to my nose, it smelled of rain and iron. Jim collected a few in a plastic bag. Weeks later, he sent them to a friend, a biologist at the University of Montana. The results came back inconclusive. Not bear, not elk. Closest genetic match, primates, but none native to this continent. When he told me that, I felt the same chill I'd felt by the frozen pond. The same awareness that we were standing on borrowed ground. We left that valley before sundown. As we packed, I noticed something odd. The birds had returned, but only beyond the ridge. The forest behind us remained mute, like it was holding a breath it had no right to exhale. The drive back was quiet. Jim kept glancing at the tree line as if expecting something to follow us. When we finally reached the main road, he said, "You ever feel like the forest remembers who walked it?" I told him yes, and that some memories probably shouldn't be disturbed. But weeks later, I went back alone. I told myself I needed to confirm what I saw, that maybe fear had distorted the details. The truth is, I just couldn't accept silence as the final word. I set up camp by the same stream. No knocks that night, no hair, no twisted trees. Just the ordinary forest, the sound of water, wind through spruce needles, the soft drumming of rain on the tent. I almost convinced myself it had all been imagination. Then around midnight, my flashlight flickered and died. The battery was full. I remember tapping it twice before realizing my entire tent had dimmed. Not from the lamp, but from the absence of reflection. Even the fabric stopped glowing in the dark. I opened the flap, and outside everything looked washed of color. Not black, not gray, just gone. Somewhere deep between the trees, I heard the knock again. 3 short paws too long, but this time no answer followed. The sound rolled across the valley like a farewell. I didn't wait for dawn. I packed what I could and left before the light returned. When I reached the car, I looked back once. The forest looked normal again, green, awake, innocent. But I knew better. I've guided people my whole life through places the maps barely touch. And I used to think the wilderness was indifferent, vast, and beautiful but unaware of us. Now I'm certain it's aware. It watches. It remembers who listens. Every time I drive through a stretch of trees and see one bent clean in half for no reason, I think of that rhythm. 3 short paws too long, like a message passed between mountains, like a language not meant for us. By the summer of 2023, I had stopped talking about it altogether. You learn after a while that silence protects you more than proof. The photos, the recordings, the hair samples, none of it mattered to anyone who hadn't heard the sound for themselves. I told myself I was done chasing ghosts in the snow, and yet when Michael Stone called from Colorado, asking if I wanted to join his climbing group for a 2-day ascent of Mount Willer, I said yes without hesitation. Michael wasn't a believer. He'd been a park instructor for 20 years. Pragmatic, careful, allergic to superstition. Maybe that's why I went. Maybe I wanted someone grounded to make sense of what I'd seen, or to convince me I'd finally imagined it all. The first day was uneventful. The mountain felt clean, transparent, almost kind. We reached the base camp at 3,700 meters by evening, surrounded by ridges that caught the last light like rusted blades. The air was thin and smelled of dust and ice. I remember thinking how far the sky looked, as if distance itself was heavier up there. The next morning, we began our final climb just after sunrise. The snow had softened, reflecting gold off the east slope. I was near the back of the group when Alan, the photographer, stopped suddenly. He was pointing his camera across the valley toward Mount Cup, about 2 kilometers away. "Something's up there," he said. We all turned. At first, I saw nothing, just the ripple of heat above the rocks. Then the haze shifted and I saw it. A figure, standing on a steep slope where no human could balance for long. It wasn't moving. It wasn't watching the valley. It was watching us. Even at that distance, you could sense the scale. 2.5 meters, maybe more. Shoulders like the curve of a tree trunk, arms hanging far below the waist. The sunlight caught patches of hair that shimmered like wet bark. Alan lifted his camera again, whispering under his breath. Michael borrowed my binoculars, squinting through the glare. I could hear the faint tremor in his breath as he lowered them. "That's not a man," he said, barely audible. We stood there for a full minute, frozen in the altitude's quiet, waiting for it to move. Then it did something I will never forget. It bent forward slowly, without bending its knees, as if bowing, or mocking or acknowledging us. The gesture was deliberate, measured, almost polite. Then it straightened and began climbing. No rope, no gear, no hesitation. It scaled the near-vertical face with the ease of an animal born for cliffs. Every motion was fluid, almost slow motion, but the speed was impossible. In less than a minute, it covered what would take an experienced climber 10. When it reached the ridge, it paused again, turned back toward us. Even from that distance, I could swear it was still looking straight at me. Then it vanished behind the crest. We didn't speak for a long time. You don't break silence after something like that. It feels sacred or dangerous. When we resumed the climb, the mountain didn't feel kind anymore. The wind carried no echo. Even the crunch of our boots seemed swallowed mid-sound. By the time we reached the summit, no one celebrated. Normally we'd take pictures, laugh, shout into the horizon. Instead, we stood in silence, surrounded by a world that suddenly felt too large, too aware. We stayed only 20 minutes before beginning our descent. Alan walked faster than usual. Michael kept glancing at the surrounding slopes. I brought up the rear, and every so often I saw it again, or thought I did. A shape too dark against the snow, moving parallel to us, always at the edge of vision. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it moved. At base camp, we found tracks circling the tents, 50 centimeters long, shallow impressions in the wind-blown dirt. Whatever made them had walked in a perfect loop, just far enough to stay unseen. The food container was open but untouched except for the meat, cans of jerky and dried beef gone. Everything else perfectly in place. Even the lock hadn't been forced. It had been unlatched. That detail disturbed me more than the figure itself. Not the strength, but the precision. Whoever or whatever had visited us wasn't hungry. It was curious, selective, intelligent. Michael said we'd report it once we got back, but he never did. None of us did. Maybe we knew it wouldn't matter. Maybe we understood that naming it would make it less real. Back home, I looked through Alan's photos. They were blurry, distorted by distance and glare. But when you enhanced the contrast, you could make out proportions no human body could mimic. The head sat low, almost blending into the torso. The arms were too long, the legs too short for the body's mass. And in one frame, its hand was resting on the rock. It had 5 fingers. A week later, a professor from the University of Colorado analyzed the shots for a local magazine. He estimated the height at between 2.4 and 2.7 meters, said the slope angle, 47 degrees, was impossible for a human to ascend that fast. His conclusion was simple. Either the image was a hoax, or something lived up there that shouldn't. He didn't say which he believed. I stopped sleeping for a while after that. Each night, I'd wake around 3 a.m., the same hour the knocks had stopped in Montana. The same pattern haunted my dreams, 3 short, 2 long, echoing through dark pine corridors. Once I thought I heard it again, not in the forest, but outside my cabin, faintly through the wall. I sat up, heart pounding, waiting for the second set of knocks. But there was only the wind scraping the eaves. Still, the rhythm stayed in my head, looping endlessly, like a message waiting for translation. Months passed and the photos spread online. Forums debated them, skeptics laughed, experts argued pixel by pixel. But no one talked about what lingered behind the image, the feeling that something old and unseen had simply turned its gaze toward us for a moment, then slipped back into shadow. Sometimes I think these mountains aren't just landforms. They're archives, storing stories in stone and snow, letting them surface only when the world forgets how to listen. And maybe that's all we ever are to them, brief visitors in someone else's memory. Because whatever walked beside us in those woods, whatever climbed that impossible slope and vanished into the clouds, didn't come to be found. It came to remind us how small we are when the forest decides to wake.